Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. What extremes do you think you'd go to in order to save the love of your life? If you're anything like Carl Tanzler, then the answer is you'd do a lot more than any rational person would expect. When Tanzler was a young man, he had a recurring dream, frequently enough that he referred to them as his visions. Visions that he believed not only shaped his destiny, but spelt out his fate in a form that he was powerless to ignore. Repeatedly he saw the same thing. Anna Constantia von Brockdorff, an ancestor of the family who died nearly 100 years before his birth. Anna Constantia von Brockdorff had been the mistress of the King of Poland for a time before being sent away to live out her days in exile. These kind of strange dreams would be the sort of thing that most people would brush aside without a second thought. But to the young Carl Tanzler, they held a special significance. To him they were otherworldly messages from the beyond, an image sent to him across the mists of time, tearing the very fabric of reality, all to show him the face of his one true love, a dark-haired, exotic and beautiful young woman. When he was born, February the 8th, 1877, in the city of Dresden, he was named George Carl Tanzler. He would later go by Carl Tanzler von Cosel. This was a tribute to the ancestor that he'd seen in his visions, as Anna Constantia von Brockdorff was also known as the Countess of Cosel. As a young man, he travelled to India and then onwards to Australia, where he spent a number of years. Here he developed interests in engineering, electronics, and a further obsession that would follow him through his life: organs. The instruments, not the physical type. Carl Tanzler was in the process of building a rudimentary plane of sorts when World War I broke out in 1914, and he and his fellow countrymen were placed in camps in Australia, allegedly for their own protection. He was then moved to Trial Bay Jail in New South Wales, where he remained for the rest of the war. His autobiography indicates that he was attempting to build a small seafaring vessel to try and escape before he was eventually released. After the war, Tanzler was released, but he wasn't allowed back to Germany. Instead, he went to Holland, where he found his mother and lived with her for 3 years. In this time frame, he met his wife Doris, with whom he had 2 daughters named Aisha and Clarista. The latter would die at the age of just 10 from diphtheria. His sister had emigrated to the US some years prior, and Carl decided to follow in her footsteps, sailing from the port of Rotterdam across to Florida via Cuba in 1926. His family followed him not long after. For reasons that aren't fully understood, he left his family at the place where they had originally landed and moved by himself to Key West, where he found work as a radiological technician in a hospital. It was at this point that he met Elena, and the visions that he'd experienced as a young man came to fruition. It just so happened that Elena looked exactly like the woman that he had seen in his visions. The only problem is that Elena was riddled with tuberculosis. And whilst TB is still a very serious condition these days, at the time when Carl Tanzler met Elena, very few people actually recovered from TB. It was one of the 2 leading causes of death in the early 1900s. Elena, or to give her full name, Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, was a Cuban-American woman, barely into her 20s, who was, by all accounts, extremely attractive. She hadn't had an easy life thus far. She'd already separated from her husband, who'd cruelly ended their marriage after she suffered a miscarriage. Her family background was fairly poor, and neither she nor her parents had much money in general. There was no way that they'd be able to afford the more expensive treatments that could have prolonged or saved her life. Carl offered to take over not only the cost of the hospital care, but to actually provide the care himself. And it should be noted that Although Carl was no doubt an extremely talented and intelligent man who had turned his hand to many skills and trades in his life with great success, he wasn't a medical doctor. Even so, Elena and her family gratefully accepted, and thus began Tanzler's myriad attempts to cure his love of TB. The treatments ranged from the conventional, such as topical ointments and tinctures, all the way through to the bizarre and painful. Carl's obsession with Elena grew as he frantically tried any treatment he could dream up, punctuated with displays and declarations of his undying love for her. In his relentless pursuit to both cure and win over the object of his affection, Carl spared no efforts, buying her clothes, offering her strange elixirs to drink, and even attempting the use of blessed or consecrated wine. Carl firmly believed in the unstoppable nature of fate. Even though all of his attempts at romance was rebuffed, he continued his efforts, believing that eventually he would win out. After all, when a vision from your childhood has guided your life up to this point, there's nothing that can really stand in your way. As her prognosis worsened and the illness ravaged her body, he brought medical equipment to her home. He attached electrodes to her and attempted electroshock therapy. This was a painful treatment that hadn't been used before or since to cure TB, because it couldn't cure TB. He even utilised an X-ray machine that he believed would charge her oxygen atoms and save her life. The whole time he showered her not only with medical care, but money, presents, and extravagant shows of affection, but they were entirely unrequited. He wasn't in the slightest bit put out or slowed down by his paramour's lack of interest in him, and he just kept it up. Gloves, dresses, flowers, perfumes. The list of gifts were as long as the list of treatments she was receiving. Unfortunately, none of the treatments seemed to work. Tragically for her family and for Carl, Elena succumbed to her illness and died in 1931. Carl Tanzler was heartbroken and he offered to pay for her funeral arrangements, which her family agreed to again. Tanzler paid to have Elena embalmed and entombed in a mausoleum. A mausoleum that was grand in construction and extremely costly. A true testament to her memory, a resting place that only he held the key to. It became widely known in the community that Carl was visiting the tomb daily, sitting outside and speaking softly to her as if she was still there, leaving small gifts. He was even said to have had a telephone installed inside the tomb. Supposedly it was to allow him to call her whilst he was away, and so it continued in this manner for around 2 years. Slowly, locals began to notice a number of strange changes in Carl's behaviour. He was seen buying perfumes and ointments despite his wife having been long gone. He was buying women's clothes. Some children even swore that they'd seen him slow dancing in his living room with a life-size mannequin of some sort. These strange rumours and speculations eventually reached Elena's sister. She thought it was odd enough to merit visiting the man who had become infatuated with her sister prior to her death. When she knocked on his door, he let her in without hesitation. He took her to the bedroom and showed her Elena lying on the bed. She was fully clothed and adorned with jewellery. It seemed like Carl Tanzler had built some sort of life-size effigy of Elena. However, the truth was much more disturbing. Police were called to the house, and when they examined this effigy, they found that it was actually the mummified body of Elena. Tanzler said that Elena had come to him in a vision. She was singing her favourite song in Spanish and requesting to be released from her tomb, and so he obliged. Under the cover of night, he went to the mausoleum and carried her body back to his home. For the following 7 years, he lived with her body in his house. Carl had worked hard to counteract the effects of the body's natural decay and tried to maintain the appearance of his one true love. He'd used wax and plaster of Paris to approximate her facial features. Her rotting eyeballs had been scooped out and replaced with glass ones. The chest cavity had been filled with rags to maintain the shape of her body. Over time, her hair had fallen out and had been replaced with a wig. The wig contained some of her actual hair that her mother had provided to Carl after her passing. Her bones were secured together with wire to ensure the structural integrity of her skeleton. He slept with her in what he referred to as their marital beds. He played her songs on his beloved organ. He danced with her and sang to her. Now, I know what some of you are probably wondering. They shared a bed together. How far did this marriage actually go? There doesn't seem to be any explicit mention that there was a sexual aspect between Carl and the remains of Elena de Hoyos. There's nothing in the autopsy or the reports on the matter that mention or even hint at anything of that nature, but we can probably assume that something that scandalous and outrageous might not have been front and centre in any documents from that period. However, they did find something unusual. Amongst the adornments that he placed on her remains and the various techniques that he utilised to try and preserve her body, there's one particular item that surely raised a few eyebrows. A tube that had been inserted into her private area. Now, it is entirely possible that there was absolutely no sexual aspect to this, but it's difficult to think of any other purpose that that tube would serve. To the surprise of no one, Carl Tanzler was arrested. The charge was wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. Given the relatively short statute of limitations that would normally apply to these cases, these charges were eventually dropped and he was set free. Elena's remains were reburied in a secret and unmarked location, but not before she'd been thoroughly examined by pathologists and then displayed at a funeral home for thousands of people to come and gawk at. The case received a lot of press coverage at the time, mainly due to its truly bizarre nature. It seems that the general perception of the public tended to lean more towards sympathy than outright disgust. The masses were understandably shocked, but as more details emerged about the effort and care that he put into maintaining her remains, it led some people to view him as a sort of romantic figure. Clearly a disturbed and extremely misguided one, but a romantic nonetheless. Following the Elena affair, Carl Tanzler moved back, settling near to where he'd originally left his wife and family years before. He wrote down the story of his life and it was published in a book that received a substantial amount of interest. Despite all the trouble it brought him, Tanzler could never quite get over the memory of his one true love. He couldn't let her fade into obscurity. He eventually constructed what he described as an effigy of her with the face cast from her death mask. There are some accounts that say when he finally passed away in 1952 at the age of 75, he died in the arms of his Elena effigy. Other people say that he'd fallen behind one of his many organs, so who really knows? Even now, there's still interest in Carl Tanzler's story and the extremes that he went to in order to preserve his one true love. When he first brought her home from the mausoleum, he'd put her in a makeshift laboratory which was in the shape of an aeroplane, and he called this Elena's airship. It was his sincere belief that he would eventually use this airship to fly Elena's remains so high into the stratosphere that the radiation from outer space would penetrate her tissues and restore life to her body. 7 years of preserving a corpse, slaving away for hours to replace the pieces that became detached or rotted away, endlessly planning and always believing, certain that he could knock down that final barrier between life and death and be with the woman that was destined for him. All because of a vision he'd had since childhood. Were these the actions of a romantic or the behaviour of an unhinged man? I mean, probably the unhinged answer. So, I hope you found this story interesting. A big thanks to Spencer for suggesting the topic for this video. It's another weird case that seems to be quite well known but's completely passed me by, so I hope you enjoyed seeing this. A lot of people messaging me with suggestions that I completely miss or just forget to respond to. It's not me being intentionally rude. Things just get buried under a load of like spam messages and things. Yeah, I have a hard time getting back to everyone who sends me messages. I apologise for that, but now and then one gets through to me, and yeah, so thanks Spencer for that suggestion. That was interesting. Big thanks as always to the channel patrons. Thank you very much for the support to everyone out there. Check out the merch store if you want some cool gear. And oh, I've just started a Twitch. I don't know how often I'm gonna do live streams there, but come check it out if you're on Twitch. I don't really know how it works. I'm just trying it out. Thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.